Hey folks, welcome back to Car Show and Tell. I'm Tim the Tool Man, and I was sitting here playing around with a couple of GM distributors, and I had a few thoughts while I was doing it, and I thought to myself, man, this might make a decent video, so why not start the camera up and talk about this for a little bit. So I've never really thought about this before till today when I was goofing around with these things. And the thought occurred to me about what an advancement these GM HEI distributors must have been for their time and their era. And I guess if we're going to get into that, we have to go dig deeper into a little bit more automotive history and talk about what had come before then and what was that was really the era for advancements in electronic ignition systems. What was around before then was you still had a distributor, but the spark was timed by what was called a set of points, and a points-and-condenser that would, depending on the quality of the parts that you had, they might go between 3,000 miles and who knows, maybe 10 for a good set. Or a dual point distributor. They had dual point distributors, and essentially it was just a pair of breaker points, and that was what closed and opened, and it timed the sparks as the rotor went round. There was also an eccentric on the distributor shaft that was, octagonal if it was an 8-cylinder, or it was hexagonal if it were a 6-cylinder, or if it were a 4-cylinder, it was a square. And it would open and close these breaker points, and what that would do is it would power the coil, and then when it would break that set of points, the field and the primary windings of the coil would collapse, and it would induce voltage into the secondary set of wiring, secondary set of coils, or secondary set of windings in the ignition coil, and it would produce a spark. And that for 70 some years, that was the pinnacle of ignition technology. Unless you were running, a magneto or something like that. But for everybody's daily driver, that was what got the job done. And, it was something that required not constant, but fairly frequent maintenance. And a lot of people carried their set of points around in their glove box. And I remember keeping a matchbook in the glove box of my old Corvair and another set of points, and making it halfway between Georgia and Florida and having to pull over because the thing wasn't running right. And you replace the points and you set the gap in the points with the thickness of the matchbook. That was how close the points needed to be together. And then some distributors, in order to get increased mileage out of this setup, you had what was called a dual point distributor, and it had two sets of those points, and one would close just before the other, and then it would open just before the other. So you got the erosion effect of the spark on one set and then the other, because every time they would come together or open up, there would be a spark between those contacts, and every time you have a spark, it tends to erode just a tiny bit of that contact. And that was what really wore the points out, was that constant spark between them. And then I think in like 1963, Pontiac developed a system, they called it the transistorized ignition system, which was a step ahead. It was generally not much more powerful than a point system. Point system would give you around 20,000 volts, fairly round number. and that was enough to do the job. But they had their limitations, especially about higher RPM. At higher RPM, you got much less dwell time for the coil, and you would get less consistent spark output the higher the RPMs went. So Pontiac had its transistorized system, and then I think maybe in 1967, GM came out with its capacitive discharge system, which used a bank of capacitors. And if you know anything about MSD, that's the technology that they adopted and ran with and continued to further develop. And I think the capacitive system was an option on Corvettes. I'm not sure if it was an option on any other cars. And I think in the early 70s, maybe 72, 73, Chrysler developed an electronic ignition system, and it had an ignition module on the firewall or inner fender, and it used a ballast resistor, and quite oftentimes those ballast resistors would burn out, and you'd have to throw another one of those on. So you went from having to keep a pair of points or a set of points in your glove box to having to keep a ballast resistor in your glove box. And then partway through, or maybe at the beginning of 74, some GM cars started showing up with these. And then in 1975, it went, I think, GM wide. Everything that GM was making was coming with an HEI ignition. And so what is an HEI ignition? Well, essentially you've still got, instead of points down here that open and close, you have a magnetic sensor that senses a peak. There's a ring around the shaft of the distributor, and it has 8 peaks on it, and every time one of those peaks passes by that sensor, it changes the resistance in that sensor, and the ignition knows it needs to fire. And beyond that, you have an integrated ignition module in your distributor, and then in your cap you have an ignition coil. It's built right in. So what were the advantages of this? Well, let's start with the repeatability or the longevity of this magnetic pickup. They're much more reliable. They're less, less maintenance than a set of points and condensers. Points and condenser. Are they perfect? No. Are they better? Sure. Do ignition modules burn up and create no start issues? Absolutely. Would they do it nearly as frequently as a set of points? No. I've replaced plenty of ignition modules in my time, albeit GM, Chrysler, and Ford. The Ford systems came out a little while later, the DuraSpark 2, and it had a separate ignition module. That was under hood, and they would be affected by variations in temperature. If they would get hot, all of a sudden they would stop working. You let it cool off, car fires up and runs again until it gets hot, and it shuts off again. Time for another ignition module. And they had their thin film ignition modules, which were screwed to the side of the distributor with some potting compound, and those had the same their issues as well. But it was, by and large, a big step ahead. But I think the GM HEI system probably did it best from the standpoint that it was an all-inclusive system. You stab your distributor, plug it in, give it 12 volts, set your timing, and away you go. Oh, and you have a tach lead. So if you want to add a tachometer, you have a convenient place to connect that tach signal. So in the old system, it would fire the coil. The coil was separated. It was divorced from the distributor, usually held in a bracket somewhere on the engine. It would fire that coil. In the old style coils, I think I have some. I think I have one somewhere. Hold on, pause that. All right, so here's an old school, what I used to call a can coil. This is pretty indicative of what would come back in the day and the type of bracket that would have held it. And like I said, it was a divorced coil. It's held on with a bracket. You have your primary contacts where you would wire it in, and your secondary contacts where your distributor wire would go. Okay. Now the primary coils were wound around the secondary coils, and when the field in the primary coils collapsed, it would induce voltage into that secondary winding, and that was where you got your ignition spark voltage from. So when GM moved to this type of coil, they did it the other way around. So instead of having your primary windings around your secondary, your primary windings are instead located in the center of your secondary windings. Now what's that mean? Well, it means your secondary windings can be much bigger than they were before, since they go around the outside of the primary windings. You actually get a more compact coil and a more powerful coil, because anytime you can increase the size of your windings, you can use more conductor, longer conductor, and you can increase the number of wraps in your winding. Or you could use multiple conductors and wrap multiple conductors around your windings, and you can induce greater voltage to a larger winding. So what you got here was a smaller, more compact coil, some would argue, with greater capability. On a coil like this, stock HEI coil, probably good for about 35,000 volts. So you've got another 40% voltage on top of that, and probably in the order of 80 or 85% more energy in that spark than you had with a traditional can coil. And then having it located right here in the middle of the cap, you can take your secondary voltage right off the coil and feed it down into the center of your rotor. So you've got less, or you don't have to feed that through a spark plug wire, through a connector, down into your rotor, and then spit it out to one of the various spark plug leads and out to your plug. You've shortened the resistance in the circuit between the coil and the plug. You've got a shorter circuit, you've removed some points of failure there, and you've got less resistance in that type of a circuit. But like I said earlier, I think just the greatest advantage of this was its modularity. You know, in 1975, you'd open the hood of your new Chevy, and you look, and there's this big black cap sitting proudly in front of the firewall like it owned it. And a lot of people went, "Oh, what's that?" So, it might have taken a little bit of time to embrace, but I think it was a big step forward in ignition technology. And another advancement or another what's the word I'm looking for? Another advantage of this type of arrangement is they're more repeatable at higher RPMs. I think you actually get a little bit more dwell time doing this electronically. You get more dwell time in the coil at higher RPMs, which produces a more reliable or more consistent spark. Now you can run the motor right up to redline, and you've greatly reduced the occurrence of, spark scatter or low spark, bad spark at high RPMs. Were they perfect? No. They had their issues. I've heard these ignition modules I've heard them called probably one of the worst automotive parts around, simply because when they fail, it's tougher to replace, tougher to service than a set of points. And you generally don't have another one in your glove box to do it under a street light. And when it goes bad, you really don't get very much warning. It's working, and then generally it's not. And there really isn't much in between. But all in all, it was a great step forward in advancing ignition technology. And these things lasted on GM stuff for a good decade at least, maybe if not a little bit longer, until they started to be replaced by, I won't say coil on plug, but I'll say coil banks, divorced coil banks, or direct fire ignition, sometimes they call it that, but generally they used coil banks, and they had 3 coils for a 6-cylinder or so on, 2 coils for a 4-cylinder, and you would get a waste spark in the middle of the cycle. But still, a good advancement. And then at one point they even developed the 5-pin ignition module, like you see here, with signal from a knock sensor, and you could retard timing. As electronic engine management, electronic engine control came into fashion, you could build a knock sensor or feed right into that, and it could retard timing a little bit as it sensed knock. So I suppose that's probably about all I wanted to say. Oh, and the cap. Not only was the cap so much bigger because it now has a coil potted into the top of it, but the actual reason or need for a larger diameter cap was to space. On the inside, you could space out the leads for your ignition rotor to strike an arc against. You could space those out further, because the problem they were having is the spark was actually jumping to some of the wrong leads, and you would get crossfire. And they found that by increasing the diameter of the cap, you could space the leads for your plugs further away from one another, and that eliminated that problem of sort of cross-firing to the wrong cylinder. And, they're not difficult to work on. They're pretty straightforward. You screw your rotor on, like so, just like any old distributor that came before it. Throw your cap on over the top of it. You don't even have to take the coil out. Connect a few wires, set your timing, and away you go. So there we have it. A bit of the secret to the GM HEI system, how it works, how it functions, and why I think it was a solid advancement in ignition technology. So there you have it. That's about all I wanted to say. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, you want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe. And we'll see you again on the next one. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.